A salt flat in the Dasht-e-Kavir Desert, 200 miles southeast of Tehran, just after midnight on the 25th of April 1980. 6 aircraft sit on a strip of hard sand the planners have code-named Desert 1, engines turning, blades beating the air into a brown wall nobody can see through. Inside one of those transports waits the most secret unit the United States Army had ever fielded, a force barely 3 years old that few Americans knew existed. This was their first real mission. Within the hour, 8 men would be dead, the aircraft would be burning, and the unit would carry the scars of this night for the rest of its life. None of the men it came to save were anywhere near this desert. You already know the name. Delta Force, the unit. The men the films would later turn into legend. But in the spring of 1980, Delta was not a legend. It was an experiment the Army was not sure it wanted, led by a colonel half the Pentagon thought was a crank. And on this night, it was about to be tested in the worst possible way. If you want the missions the official record buried, subscribe to War Code. This is one of them. To understand why these men were standing in an Iranian desert in the dark, you have to go back to the 4th of November, 1979. A mob of Iranian students poured over the walls of the United States Embassy in Tehran and seized everyone inside. 66 Americans taken at gunpoint. By the spring of 1980, after a handful of early releases, more than 50 of them were still held. Blindfolded, paraded for cameras, threatened with show trials and execution. A superpower stood flat-footed while its diplomats rotted in a compound in the heart of a hostile city. Every day they stayed captive. The humiliation deepened. Diplomacy went nowhere. Sanctions went nowhere. So the men at the top turned to the one card they had been quietly holding, a brand new counter-terror unit built by an officer named Charlie Beckwith, who had spent a year on exchange with Britain's elite SS and come home convinced the American Army needed something exactly like it. He got his wish in 1977. He named it the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. Most of the Army had no idea it was there, and now before it had ever fired a shot in anger, it was being handed the hardest job in the world. The timing could not have been crueler. Delta had been certified ready for exactly this kind of mission only that autumn. Signed off as mission capable after a brutal final exercise, and the embassy fell within days of that certification. A unit that had been an idea on paper a few years earlier, never once tested against a real enemy, was suddenly the entire plan. Army engineers built a full-scale mock-up of the Tehran embassy compound at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, and the operators rehearsed the breach there over and over. Walls and rooms and angles burned into muscle memory, while more than 50 Americans sat in cells on the other side of the world. The plan was a machine with too many moving parts. 8 Navy Sea Stallion helicopters would lift off the deck of the carrier USS Nimitz, sitting 60 miles off the Iranian coast, and fly low and dark deep into enemy airspace. 6 Air Force transports would come the other way, more than 1,000 miles out of Masira Island off the coast of Oman, carrying Delta, a team of Rangers, and the fuel. They would all meet in the middle of nowhere at Desert 1. The helicopters would drink fuel from rubber bladders rolled out of the tankers, load the assault force, and carry them to a hide site outside Tehran. The next night, the operators would storm the embassy, free the hostages, and fly everyone out. The whole thing depended on machines arriving on time, in the dark, in total silence, with no margin for error. Rangers would seize and hold the desert strip while the transports were on the ground. A force of around 130 assault and security troops moving across a patch of Iranian soil no American was ever supposed to stand on. What few knew then and fewer know now is that the rescue had already begun inside Tehran itself. A retired Special Forces officer named Dick Meadows, one of the most respected soldiers of his generation, had slipped into the city under a false identity, posing as an Irish businessman in the European car trade. He and a small team working for the Central Intelligence Agency had rented a warehouse and quietly staged the vehicles the assault would need, 5 Ford trucks and 2 Mazda vans, fitted with hidden compartments to smuggle Delta operators past Iranian checkpoints. The plan for the second night was precise and brutal. More than 90 operators would breach the embassy compound while a smaller team hit the foreign ministry where 3 more Americans were held, and then trucks would carry everyone to a stadium for the helicopters to lift them out. Men were already on the ground in the enemy capital, waiting for the force grinding toward them through the dark. The margin disappeared fast. About 100 miles into Iran, the helicopters flew straight into a haboob, an enormous suspended cloud of fine desert dust that swallowed the formation whole. The Air Force weathermen had never warned the pilots it could happen. Strict radio silence meant the planes ahead could not tell the helicopters behind what was coming. Marine pilots who had flown combat in Vietnam later called those hours in that milk-colored dust the worst experience of their lives. Instruments spun, horizons vanished, and one by one the helicopters began to fall out of the mission. The first to go was Bluebeard 6. A warning light flagged a possible crack in a rotor blade, and the crew sat down in the desert and walked away from the aircraft, transferring to another bird. Then Bluebeard 5 lost its flight instruments inside the dust and turned back toward the carrier. The pilot fighting vertigo, not knowing he was only about 25 minutes from clear sky on the far side. 8 helicopters had launched. Now 6 were limping toward Desert 1, which was exactly the bare minimum the planners had said the mission needed to go forward. 6 would have been survivable. 6 did not last. When the formation finally reached the landing strip, the 6th helicopter, Bluebeard 2, arrived with a failed secondary hydraulic system. The Marine commander of the helicopter element looked at that aircraft, heavy with fuel, in rising desert heat, and made a hard call. He would not fly it. A hydraulic failure at full weight could lock the controls in flight and kill everyone aboard. That left 5 mission-capable helicopters against a minimum of 6. This was the moment the whole night turned on. Charlie Beckwith stood on that salt flat and did the math no commander ever wants to do. 5 helicopters could not carry his assault force, the hostages, and the crews back out. He would not gut his rescue team to make the numbers work, because a team too small to take the embassy was no rescue at all, just more hostages. So Beckwith, the man who had fought for years to build this unit, recommended killing its first mission with his own mouth. The word went up the chain by satellite radio to the White House, and President Jimmy Carter approved the abort. The hardest thing a soldier can do is quit when he is finally in the fight. Beckwith did it because the alternative was sending men to die for nothing. And then, in the act of leaving, the disaster everyone feared arrived. The aircraft had to reshuffle on the ground to clear a path and top off fuel before the long flight home. In the darkness and the rotor wash, one of the helicopters, Bluebeard 2, lifted and drifted in a blinding cloud of its own dust. It slid sideways into one of the EC-130 tankers parked on the strip. The spinning rotor chewed into the fuselage, and the desert lit up. Both aircraft were loaded with fuel and ammunition, and the fire touched it all off. Red-hot metal screamed across the landing zone. Men poured out of the burning transport, and when the fire finally died, 8 Americans were gone. Here's the fact this audience knows, and the lazy retellings get wrong. The 8 men who died at Desert 1 were not Delta operators. They were aircrew, 5 airmen from the Air Force tanker, and 3 Marines from the helicopter. The men who built and flew the machines, the ones who got the shooters to the fight, were the ones who paid in blood that night. 4 more were badly burned and pulled out alive by Delta medics on the flight home. The operators Beckwith had trained for years to breach that embassy never got to do their job. They flew out of Iran having lost a battle they were never allowed to fight. If you have made it this far, you are already one of us. Cadets get every video 24 hours early and a badge in the comments. The link is below. And they were not the only Americans the night put at risk. Dick Meadows was still inside Tehran when the mission collapsed, and his cover suddenly hung by a thread. As the classified documents left burning in the wreckage at Desert 1 could expose the entire operation and everyone tied to it. He did not run. He kept the nerve that had made him a legend, walked through the airport like the businessman his passport claimed he was, and flew out of Iran on an ordinary commercial flight with his cover still intact. The men in the desert were not the only ones who had gambled everything on that night working. What they left behind on that salt flat became one of the most painful images in American military history: burned-out aircraft, classified documents. The bodies of the dead recovered later by the Iranians and displayed to the cameras. The Ayatollah Khomeini stood before his country and sneered. Who crushed Mr. Carter's helicopters? The Sands did. They were God's agents. A superpower had reached out its hand to save its people and pulled back a stump. For Delta Force, a unit that did not officially exist, this was the worst possible debut. The whisper inside the Pentagon was simple and cruel. The experiment had failed. But the men who studied what happened in that desert did not see only failure. They saw a list of reasons, and every reason was fixable. When the smoke cleared, the Joint Chiefs handed the investigation to a retired admiral named James Holloway, and Holloway and his review group tore the mission apart, their report cut to the bone. It identified 23 separate problems that had haunted Eagle Claw, and few of them were about courage. They were about wiring. The pilots and the operators had trained in separate worlds and barely rehearsed together. There was no single joint commander who owned the whole thing from the carrier deck to the embassy wall. The communications were a patchwork. The air crews were not specialized for the kind of long, dark, low-level flying the mission demanded. The men were willing. The system underneath them was broken, and this is where the night in the desert stops being a tragedy and becomes the origin story of everything that came after. The American military looked at the 8 bodies from Desert One and decided this would never happen again. The fixes were not slogans. They were institutions, and they are the ones this audience reveres today. The Pentagon stood up a permanent headquarters to command its elite units under one roof, so that the next time the country sent its best men into the dark, one commander would own every piece of it. That command was the Joint Special Operations Command, SOC, born directly out of the ashes of Desert One. Then they fixed the machines and the men who flew them. The helicopters had failed in the dust because no unit in the Army specialized in flying that hard, that low, that dark on a moonless night over hostile ground, so the Army built one. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, whose entire reason to exist is to put special operators on a target in the worst conditions on Earth and never miss the landing zone. Their motto became Night Stalkers Don't Quit, and every man who wears that patch is flying in the long shadow of the crews who died at Desert One. A communications unit was created to make sure the radios would never again be a patchwork. And within a few years, the whole architecture of American Special Operations was rebuilt from the ground up. 7 years after the desert, in 1987, the entire web of these units was pulled under a single roof, United States Special Operations Command, the headquarters that still runs America's elite forces today, all of it traceable to one burning salt flat in Iran. Look at what this means for Delta. The unit walked out of that desert humiliated, its first mission a smoking wreck, written off by half the brass in Washington. But the lessons of that failure built the exact system that would turn Delta into the most feared direct action force on the planet. The dedicated aviation, the Joint Command, the brutal emphasis on rehearsal and inter-service coordination. The entire professional machine that lets a Tier 1 unit hit a compound on the far side of the world and walk out clean. Every flawless raid you have ever admired, every door the D-Boys ever kicked at the perfect second with the perfect support overhead, sits on a foundation poured at Desert One. The unit that burned in the Iranian desert is the reason the unit became untouchable. The men captured in Tehran did not come home that spring. The raid freed no one. The more than 50 Americans still held in that city stayed in captivity for another long, grinding stretch, and the 52 who remained were not released until the 20th of January, 1981, 444 days after they were first taken, walking free in the very minutes Ronald Reagan was being sworn in. Eagle Claw did not save them. Diplomacy and time and a change of administration did. What Eagle Claw saved was every operation that came after it. So here is the part worth arguing about, and I want the veterans and the serious students of this in the comments. We call Desert One a disaster, and on its own terms it was. 8 dead, 5 burned, not one hostage freed, a superpower embarrassed in front of the world. But ask yourself what American Special Operations would look like today if that night had gone smoothly. No catastrophe, no Holloway report, no JSOC, no Night Stalkers, no hard-won obsession with getting the whole machine right. It is an ugly thing to say out loud, but the failure in that desert may have saved more American lives over the next 40 years than a clean success ever could have. Tell me I am wrong. Tell me a victory that night would have taught the same lessons. Because the men who died at Desert One were the price of a lesson the United States military had refused to learn any cheaper way, and the unit that stood in that brown wall of dust watching its first mission burn did not break. It went home, it buried its dead, it studied every mistake, and it came back as the standard the whole world now measures itself against. Official members get the parts that do not survive the public versions, the names and the details we cut before publish. The door is below.